Hi, I'm Scott Telek, author of the Swithen Arthurian book series, which is retelling the Arthurian legends across 25 novels, 7 of which are out right now, and I'm at work on number 8, with a focus on remaining absolutely faithful to the legends as put down before the year 1485, so we can retain the medieval feel and magic of them without trying to fix it or update it for modern audiences. So why is it important to remain faithful to the medieval legend and not try to update it? And on a larger level, what is the whole purpose and the role that the Arthurian legends serve? To answer that question, we're going to dip into some of the concepts presented by Freud, and more specifically a child psychologist working in the Freudian model, Bruno Bettelheim. Now, we all think that we know the Arthurian legend, but most of us are not really familiar with what's actually in the medieval writings. If you've only seen movies or TV shows, you get the adventure and romance and the magic, but you don't get the real texture of the stories, which present us with a bunch of strange adventures that bring up moral quandaries that the story then invites us to work through. For example, King Arthur has a child that is prophesied to be the destruction of him and his kingdom. He tries to have the child killed, but of course he survives and does end up killing Arthur at the very end. So despite all his efforts, Arthur can never overcome the consequences of that one youthful mistake. Also, Sir Lancelot is told his entire life that he is the perfect knight, but later he has to face that his love of Arthur's wife Guinevere makes him imperfect and ultimately costs him his ability to reach the Holy Grail. This other knight, Balin, is told again and again that if he continues on his path, he'll doom himself. But to turn back would mean reneging on a promise, and a knight, above all, is supposed to keep his promises. So in large and small ways, the Arthurian legends present stories with a bunch of moral quandaries that invite us to think through them and consider how best to act. We also know that in the story itself, a key topic for the characters is how to act in the best and most moral way. They all aspire to chivalry, which is a moral code that inspires them to act with honor and gain worthiness through doing good and valiant deeds. And each year, the Knights of the Round Table swear to uphold the Pentecostal oath, which tells them to care for and protect women, the poor, the elderly, and the church, to keep their promises and work to protect others. So in the Arthurian legend, being a good person and acting in moral ways is a central topic of the stories and something the characters themselves are always talking about. Now let's consider the world in which these stories were invented and told. It was what we used to call the Dark Ages, from the year 500 to the early 1200s, when most people lived in small kingdoms and there was nearly constant warfare. They could not read, and there was almost no cultural or literary output. So there's no reason to think that they were not intelligent, but they were not educated as we would think of that today. They could not read or write, so they're not composing their thoughts in language. They know very little about science or art and are living a very basic, grounded life. So into that, you bring these stories that are about how to treat each other, how best to get along with others, and how to act in a moral way toward your fellow human beings. So now let's switch to Freud and how Freud's thoughts can help us understand the Arthurian legends and how they might have worked for these people in the Middle Ages. There was one important moment for me in understanding the figure of King Arthur himself, since on the page he's a fairly blank archetype and doesn't have a lot of personality. And as a novelist, I have to try to make him into a real human being with an understandable and relatable psychology. So in his essay called Family Romances, Freud talks about that many children, as they start to grow up, start to believe that their actual parents are not their parents, but that they'll find out that they're the long-lost son or daughter of the king and queen. Now we have to remember that Freud is writing in Europe in the late 1800s, so thinking you're the child of the king or queen is not like completely out of the blue. Now, Freud says that this happens because the child remembers the carefree early days with their parents, but as they start to grow out of childhood, their parents want them to do chores and clean their room and are just generally annoying. So they start to want to return to those carefree days when they were coddled and everything was easy. And one way to imagine that is to start to daydream that you're actually the long-lost child of the king and queen, and they'll soon realize it and whisk you away to the life of ease that you deserve. Now to King Arthur, this actually happens. He actually does discover that his birth parents are the king and queen, and that he's destined to live a life much more exalted than he ever could have imagined. So Arthur is that archetype. He's a symbol of a dream existence, and he lives the life the rest of us dream of. And in the rest of the Arthurian legend, he presides over a world that's much more dreamlike than reality, where truly strange, symbolically charged things are happening all the time. Now, why is that? To think about it, let's turn to a disciple of Freud's, child psychologist Bruno Bettelheim. Bruno Bettelheim is best known for a book called The Uses of Enchantment, which deconstructs fairy tales within the framework established by Freud, including the idea that we all have our consciousness, which is where we manage our day-to-day lives, and we each have an unconscious, which is roiling with intense emotions and violent and sexual thoughts, so unruly that we have to keep it beneath our level of consciousness, because if left completely unchecked, those unruly thoughts and emotions could spill out into our conscious lives with disastrous results. Now, what Bettelheim says about fairy tales articulates some of the things I think about the Arthurian legends and how they work. Am I saying that the Arthurian legends are fairy tales? No, I am not, because the Arthurian legends deal in adult matters such as violence and sexuality in a much more direct, more adult way than we'd ever find in a fairy tale. But the effect of the stories might function in a similar way. Even J.R.R. Tolkien, author of Lord of the Rings, in his introduction to his translation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, refers to Arthurian romances as a fairy tale for adults. Bettelheim says, myths and fairy tales both answer the eternal questions. What is the world really like? How am I to live my life in it? How can I truly be myself? Myths and fairy tales speak to us in the language of symbols representing unconscious content. Their appeal is simultaneously to our conscious and unconscious mind. In the tale's content, inner psychological phenomena are given body and symbolic form. So overall, he's saying that fairy tales help us process the important questions of life. But how do they do that? Bettelheim says that fairy tales let us work through unconscious thoughts and feelings. He says that fairy tales allow kids to bring up their most unruly feelings, like jealousy at siblings or anger at their parents, and process those feelings in a harmless and positive way. Now, the Arthurian legend also does this, but for adult feelings like violence, sexual desire, love, hate, jealousy, but with an intensity suitable to adults in stories where people actually do get killed, actually kill others, and do get involved in some pretty messy sexual situations. It deals in very primal emotions, but it lets people explore those emotions in a safe setting by just hearing about how others deal with those situations and thinking about how they themselves would deal with it. Bettelheim says, in order to master the psychological problems of growing up, a child needs to understand what's going on with his conscious self, so he can also cope with what's going on in his unconscious. He can achieve this by becoming familiar with it through spinning out daydreams. By doing this, the child fits unconscious content into conscious fantasies, which then enable him to deal with that content. When unconscious material is to some degree permitted to come to awareness and work through an imagination, its potential for causing harm to ourselves and others is much reduced. So he's saying that through these stories we can process some of our intense emotions and get a hold of them before they do us harm in the real world. Bettelheim also says that it's crucial that the stories be unrealistic. Something I found very interesting and Bettelheim says about fairy tales is that it's very important that the stories not be realistic. The reason for that is because if they were realistic, we'd be thinking rational thoughts like, well, how'd they get from here to there, and how long would it take them to travel that far? Whereas if the story is unrealistic from the start, it shuts that logical part of our brain down and launches the story right up onto the level of the symbolic, where we can process the meaning and emotions brought on by it in a pure state without trying to make sense of it. The unrealistic nature of these tales is an important device because it makes obvious that the fairy tale's concern is not useful information about the external world, but the inner processes taking place in an individual. So he's saying that the stories have to be unrealistic in order for our logical brain to shut down and for us to process them purely on the level of the symbolic. Bettelheim also says that the hero doesn't always have to win. He says that the story doesn't have to exactly mirror what should be done in the real world. Specifically, that the hero doesn't always have to do the right thing and the hero doesn't always have to win in the end. He says what's most important is the child identifies with the hero's wish to be good, and so they'll want to be like the hero and want to strive to be good. Compare this to some of our current entertainments in which our heroes always do and say the perfect thing and are kind of boring and forgettable, whereas in the Arthurian legend, our characters make awful mistakes and do horrible things and yet are unforgettable. It's not that the fact that virtue wins out at the end, which promotes morality, but that the hero is most attractive to the child who identifies with the hero in all his struggles. So he's saying the hero doesn't always have to do the right thing, but what's important is that we identify with their wish to be good so that we ourselves will also strive to be good. So I think that the Arthurian legends function by the same rules as fairy tales in these respects. These stories resonate with meaning and encourage people to bring up and think through moral issues like how should they act toward their neighbor? How should men act toward women? How should honorable people aspire to act? And what good does it do you to want to be honorable and to keep your promises? In the Arthurian legend, a key part of the story is the goal to aspire to honor and worthiness, to treat women well, and also to protect and care for the poor and the elderly. The Arthurian stories are definitely unrealistic, so listeners would stop thinking of what they mean in a practical way and understand that they're operating on the level of the symbolic. They understand that Arthur is not a specific man, but a figure that represents an ideal of greatness, presiding over a dream world that represents very real and very adult emotions playing out that can be processed in a harmless way. And they can see that, like them, these characters make bad mistakes, then face the consequences of those mistakes and try to do better and be decent people in the long run. Now, when you think about these people of the early Middle Ages hearing these stories, you can imagine how they might have functioned to get them thinking about why to be good people and why to treat each other with respect and honor. So in that way, the concepts of Freud and the writings of Bruno Bettelheim on fairy tales can offer us a way to think about the purpose and intent of the Arthurian legends. I hope that offers a way to think about how the Arthurian legends might have functioned for people in the past and how they still function for us today. Thank you for watching. If you like, you can check out my book series, The Swithen, that remains completely faithful to the stories as they were put down in the Middle Ages, in part to preserve the larger symbolic mysteries and faithfully convey the introspective world of the Arthurian legends.